These are a few electrolytic capacitors which I fished out from my recycle bin, or rather electronic junk box recently. The focus will be on this bigger one. You can see that this has a higher capacity rated at 1000 microfarad. The working voltage is given as 50 volts. And you can see that there is a minus sign here. That means this particular lead is for negative electrode and this one is positive. Another way of finding out is by the usual notation. The positive one will be longer. This is followed for most of the electronic components like diodes. Filter capacitors are used to smooth out the ripples in rectified DC. That is, when you use a diode, rectifier diode to rectify AC to DC, there will be ripples. Ripples in a rectified current can be smoothened by using high value capacitors like this. This is 1000 microfarad. You can use 2000 also, and multiple capacitors in parallel as well to smooth out the ripples in rectified current. And additionally, you could use inductors also to smooth out the output waveform of the rectifier much more. The smaller capacitors seen here are usually used in various electronic circuits. They are not meant as filter capacitors, and they all will have their own working voltage and capacity written on them. I am not going into each and every one because large number is there. Capacitors in general have two conducting plates separated by an insulator, and depending on the type of insulator, you have air capacitors. Earlier we used to call them as condensers as well. Then paper can be there in paper capacitors. These are electrolytic capacitors which have a polarity. The other types like ceramic capacitor, paper capacitor, air capacitor, they do not have a polarity. But electrolytic capacitors have to be connected according to the polarity. The insulating material between the capacitor plates is known as dielectric. So in case of air condenser or air capacitor, the dielectric is air. Paper capacitor will have paper, thin layer of paper between the plates as dielectric. In conventional air capacitors, the plates are metal. They were mostly used in tuning capacitors or gang capacitors, and high voltage capacitors needed extra space between the metal plates. In case of electrolytic capacitors, a thin layer of electrolyte acts as the conducting material. There are few symbols associated with capacitors. This symbol 2 lines is for a fixed value capacitor like the ones which I have shown. And this is a polarized capacitor. Electrolytic capacitors have positive and negative poles which are to be connected according to that in the circuit, while ceramic and paper capacitors or air capacitors do not need that. And this is the symbol for a variable capacitance, mostly used in tuning, and sometimes there are presets also. You can use a screw to change the capacitance and then fix it like that. It will not be a tuning knob in some of the preset capacitors. They are usually smaller ones also. You may need to combine two capacitors to increase the capacity. When two capacitors are connected in parallel, the total capacity will be sum of the two capacities. Suppose you combine 2000 microfarad capacitors in parallel, then it will be acting as a 2000 microfarad capacitor. If you combine in series, the capacity will be lower.